There's a kind of fear that does not scream. It does not shake. It goes very still, the way a rabbit goes still in tall grass when the shadow of a hawk crosses the ground. It holds its breath. It calculates. And then, if it is smart enough and fast enough and desperate enough, it runs. Martha Calloway knew that fear the way she knew the calluses on her own hands. She had lived inside it since the night they buried her husband in ground so hard they had to use a pickaxe to break it. And the wind came down off the Llano Estacado like something personal, like it was trying to finish what it started. She had stood over that shallow grave with her daughter pressed against her hip, and she had not cried. Not because she was hard, because she was doing the math. 2 horses, 12 days of flour, 1 rifle, and she had never once fired straight. The grief could wait. The grief would have to wait. That was 2 years ago. Now the grief was buried somewhere beneath the floor of a life that did not leave room for it. And Martha Calloway was a woman who woke before dawn and worked until dark and did not let herself think too far ahead, because too far ahead was a place with no floor in it. Her daughter's name was Ellie. She was 7 years old and built like her father, all long limbs and serious eyes, with a habit of asking questions that Martha could never fully answer. Why does the sky turn that color? Why do the coyotes sound sad? Why did Papa have to go? Martha had learned to say, I don't know, with the same tone she used for everything else, steady and flat, the tone that meant the subject was closed, not because it wasn't important, but because falling apart was a luxury they could not currently afford. They lived on a 40-acre plot in the broken country west of the Concho River, the kind of land that punished optimism. The house was 2 rooms and a lean-to, and it kept out most of the wind. The garden was stubborn, but alive. The nearest neighbor was a man named Gideon Farr, who was 3 miles east, and not the kind of man you went to for help unless you had already exhausted every other option, because his help always came with a cost that was harder to name than money. It was late September when the trouble started. The kind of September that lies to you, all blue sky and cool morning, making you believe the worst is behind you. Martha had been splitting wood behind the house, Ellie playing in the dirt near the fence post with a collection of smooth stones she had been accumulating for months, organizing and reorganizing them by some logic that only made sense to her. Martha heard the horses first. Not 1 horse, several, and they were not coming down the road. She set the axe head on the ground and stood very still and listened, and the sound was wrong in a way she could feel in her back teeth. Horses moving through brush, moving quiet, the way horses move when the people on them want them to be quiet. She did not think. She moved. Ellie was in her arms before the girl had time to ask a question, and Martha was through the back door of the house and pressing her back against the interior wall with her hand over Ellie's mouth before she even registered making those decisions. The rifle was on the wall. She took it down. Her hands were steady in the way that terrified her, because her hands were only steady when the part of her brain that ran on fear had already handed the controls over to something older and colder that did not feel things, only solve them. Through the single window, she could see the eastern edge of the property. There were 5 of them. She knew enough to know what she was looking at. She had lived on this frontier long enough to have learned the difference between a raiding party and a hunting party, and what she was looking at was not a hunting party. They were moving with intention. They were moving toward her house. She had 12 rounds. 5 men, 12 rounds. And Ellie pressed against her side, making no sound, because she was her mother's daughter, and she understood, at 7 years old, that sometimes the correct answer to a question was silence. Martha looked at her daughter's face, those serious eyes looking back up at her, looking to her the way children look to their mothers when the world stops making the kind of sense it made before. And something moved through Martha Calloway that she could not name, something that was not courage, because courage implies a choice, and she did not feel like she had a choice. She felt like a woman standing on a very narrow ledge who would do whatever the ledge required of her. She checked the rifle. She thought about the back window, the gully behind the property that ran northeast toward the river. If she could get Ellie to the gully, if she could get enough distance between the house and the tree line, if. The men outside were not moving fast. That was the thing that scared her most. Fast meant impulsive. This was deliberate. This was organized. She was still running the geometry of escape routes when she heard something that stopped all of it. A voice. Outside. Calling. Not in English. And then, separated from the group by a distance she could not judge, a single rider appeared at the northern tree line. Alone. Sitting his horse the way certain men sit horses, like the animal is an extension of the decision they have already made. He was watching the 5 men, not the house, the men. Martha had lived long enough on this frontier to know that the politics of the people who had lived on this land before anyone put a name to it were not simple. That not every warrior was the same warrior. That there were allegiances and feuds and old debts running through this landscape the same way there were old watercourses running beneath the dry ground. Invisible, present, complicated. She did not know this man, but she watched him watching the 5 men, and she understood, in the way you sometimes understand something before your mind has fully assembled the evidence, that he was not with them. She made a decision. It was not a smart decision by any measurable standard. It was the decision of a woman who had already done the math and found that all the numbers were bad, and so she stopped doing math and started doing something else. Something that her husband would have called faith, and that she would have called, if she was being honest, a kind of controlled desperation. She opened the back door. She stepped out with Ellie in her arms, and she walked toward the single rider at the tree line, and she did not look at the 5 men, even though she could feel them the way you feel a fire in a room you're not looking at. She walked until she was close enough that he could see her face. His face did not change. He was looking at her the way you look at a thing you have not fully classified yet, not with hostility, with attention. And Martha Calloway looked at this man, this stranger on this horse in this broken country, and she said the only thing she had in her. Take her. Take my daughter and go. They are hunting her. Please. She held Ellie up toward him. The 5 men were moving now. She could hear it. She did not turn around. The rider looked at the child. He looked at the mother. He looked at the 5 men. And then he did something that Martha Calloway would turn over in her mind for the rest of her life. On ordinary days, and on the days that were not ordinary, when sleep came slowly and the wind off the Llano sounded like something personal. He leaned down from his horse and took the child. He held her against his chest with one arm, and she did not cry, and he did not speak, and for one suspended moment, the whole landscape held its breath. Then he turned his horse, and he was gone to the tree line, and Ellie was gone with him, and Martha turned around to face the 5 men coming across her property. Her hands were steady. The grief would have to wait. The 5 men spread as they approached, the kind of spread that means someone has done this before, practiced the geometry of it, which direction cuts off which escape, who stays back to watch, and who comes forward to talk, because there's always a talking part, and Martha knew this too. She had learned things in 2 years on this land that she had never wanted to know. The one who came forward was older than the others. He had a face that had been in weather for a long time. He looked at the rifle, and he looked at her face, and he did not seem particularly concerned by either. He said something to the men on his sides that she could not hear. Then he looked past her toward the tree line where the rider had disappeared. She had perhaps 20 seconds before he understood what had just happened. She used them. She did not run because running is an invitation, and she had learned that too. She backed toward the gully. Slow, deliberate, the rifle up, making herself large in the way that prey animals make themselves large. Because even in the animal kingdom, the gesture sometimes works. Sometimes the math of the attack changes when the cost of it goes up. The man watched her. His expression was not rage. It was worse than rage. It was the expression of a man revising a plan, running new numbers, deciding. She reached the gully edge. She went over it backward, feet finding the slope, and then she was below the sight line, and she was moving along the gully bottom, and the cottonwood were closing over her, and the sound of the horses above was a sound she was moving away from, step by step, breath by breath, the terror running clean through her the way cold water runs through dry ground, filling every crack. She did not know where the rider had taken her daughter. She did not know if she would ever see Ellie again. She knew the direction of the river. She ran. The cottonwoods moved around her, and the light was failing at the edges of the afternoon, and somewhere ahead of her was the Concho, and somewhere ahead of the Concho was whatever came next, and Martha Calloway did not let herself think about Ellie's face or those serious eyes or the way her daughter had not cried when the stranger took her, because if she thought about that, she would stop running, and stopping was the one thing she absolutely could not do. The gully curved northeast. She followed it. Behind her, she could hear the horses moving along the rim above. They had not come down into the gully yet. She did not know why, and she did not wait to find out. The light kept failing. She kept running. And above the broken country of the Concho basin, the sky turned the color of a wound, and the first stars came out one by one, and The wind came down off the Llano the way it always came, personal, cold, indifferent to the specific grief of any particular woman running through any particular gully on any particular evening in the long, violent history of that landscape. Martha Calloway ran until the gully ended at the river. She stood at the water's edge and looked at the dark water moving past, and she pressed her back against a limestone wall, and she breathed. She thought about the rider's face. She thought about the way he had taken Ellie without hesitation, without negotiation, without asking her any of the questions that were logically required. She thought about her daughter riding away into the tree line in the arms of a man she did not know. She thought about the word please, and whether it had mattered or whether it was just the last word she said to her daughter's back as she disappeared into the cedar. The river moved past. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked back the way she had come, at the darkness in the gully, at the absence of the horses that had been following her, at the particular quality of silence that meant either she was safe or the danger had simply taken a different shape. She did not know which. She started moving along the river, because movement was the only kind of answer she had, and because somewhere on the other side of this night was a morning, and in that morning there was a direction, and in that direction there was her daughter, and that was enough. That had to be enough. The river moved with her, cold and indifferent and present, the way rivers are, caring nothing for the specific weight of what any particular person is carrying, only moving, only going the way all water goes toward whatever is lower, toward whatever opening it can find in the rock. Martha moved with it, and the dark came down fully around her, and the stars were extraordinary in the way that frontier stars are extraordinary, too many and too bright, the sky doing nothing to comfort anyone, just being what it was, enormous and cold and full of light that was coming from so far away it had no idea what it was shining on. She kept moving, one foot, then the other, the river to her left, the dark country to her right, and somewhere ahead, somewhere past the cedar and the limestone and the cold and the dark, a child who did not cry when a stranger took her, a child who was her mother's daughter, a child who understood, at 7 years old, that sometimes the correct answer to a question was silence. Martha Calloway moved along the river, and she did not stop, and she did not look back, and the wind off the Llano followed her the whole way, personal and cold and indifferent, the way wind is, the way grief is, the way the things you cannot put down are present even when you stop carrying them, moving even when you stand still, the landscape of this country and the landscape of this woman made of the same broken stone, the same stubborn refusal to be anything other than what they were. The night was long. She was longer. The man's name, as Ellie would later learn to say it, sounded like water moving over flat stone. She could not hold all of it in her 7-year-old mouth, so she held the first part of it, and later, much later, she would say that name in her sleep, which is how you know a word has gone past the brain and into the body. But that first night she did not know his name. She only knew the horse beneath her and the arm around her and the cedar branches moving past her face in the dark, close enough to touch, the smell of them sharp and cold like something cleaned by weather. She did not cry. This was not bravery. It was a kind of extreme attention, the attention of a child who understands at some cellular level that the situation is too large for any response she currently has available. And so she set down all the responses she had and simply looked. She cataloged the man's arm, the texture of his shirt, the sound of the horse's breathing, the direction of the stars, because her father had shown her how to find north before he got sick, back when finding north was a game and not a survival skill. North was behind her. They were moving west and south. She filed this information. The man did not speak to her. He did not need to. He held her the way you hold something you've been asked to hold carefully, attentive to its weight and its fragility without making a performance of the attention. She could feel his heartbeat against her back. Steady, slower than her own. She matched her breathing to his. This was something her mother did sometimes, when Ellie couldn't sleep, when the coyotes were loud, and the dark outside the window seemed active rather than just dark. Her mother would lie beside her and breathe very slowly, and Ellie would follow the sound of it down into something quieter. It worked now the same way it worked then, and she did not find it strange that it worked with a stranger because the body does not check credentials when it needs to calm down. They rode for a long time. The stars moved. The cedar thinned. The ground changed under the horse's feet, the sound of it going softer, and then Ellie smelled water before she saw it, the deep mineral smell of a place where water has been for a long time, limestone and moss, and the specific cold that collects near moving water at night. The man stopped the horse. He looked at the ground for a while. He looked at the trees. He made a decision that Ellie could feel him making, the slight shift in his body that meant he had run numbers, and picked a direction. He moved them into a cluster of live oak that came down close to the water and stopped there, and dismounted with her in one arm, which she found impressive in the uncomplicated way that children find physical competence impressive. He set her on her feet on the ground and looked at her. In the dark, his face was a collection of angles. She could not read it the way she could read her mother's face, which she could read in complete darkness by sound and temperature alone. But she looked at it anyway, the way she looked at her stones, cataloging, trying to understand the system. He said something to her. She did not understand the words. She understood the tone. The tone said, "Stay here, stay quiet, I will be back." She sat down with her back against the largest oak, and she watched him move into the dark with the horse, and she pulled her knees to her chest, and she looked at the stars through the oak branches, and she thought about her mother. She did not let herself think about the word if. The word if was a place with no floor in it, and she was her mother's daughter, and she had learned at 7 to stay on floors. She thought about the stones she had left near the fence post. The organization system she had been refining. She had been sorting them by weight and color simultaneously, a complex system that required you to make judgment calls about which property mattered more when they contradicted each other. It was satisfying in the way that complex systems are satisfying, not because they resolve the complexity, but because they give the complexity a shape. The man came back without the horse. He sat down 3 feet from her, not beside her, not far, a considered distance. He looked at the dark water. She looked at the dark water. For a long time, neither of them did anything else. Then he reached into the fold of what he was wearing, and he produced something she could not immediately identify, and he held it out toward her. She leaned forward. Dried meat. She could not have described what animal it came from or how it was prepared, and she did not try. She took it because she was hungry in the practical way that children get hungry when they have been moving through crisis and using up all their fuel on something other than hunger, and only afterward does the body send the invoice. She ate. He watched the tree line. This was how the first night passed. Not comfortably, not uncomfortably, in a kind of neutral presence that Ellie would spend years trying to describe to people who had not experienced it. The feeling of being with someone who has no agenda toward you except keeping you alive, which is a more uncomplicated feeling than most human relationships offer. Dawn came slowly, the sky going gray before it went pink, the birds starting their announcement of it before the light confirmed anything. The man's face became readable in a new light. He was not old the way her father had become old at the end, hollowed and yellow and distant. He was weathered in the way that the limestone hills were weathered, shaped by exposure into something harder and more specific than it started. He had a scar along his jaw that disappeared into the line of his chin. His eyes were the color of the river rocks she collected, not any one color, shifting depending on the light. He was looking at her. She looked back. He said something, a different tone this time. This tone was a question. She understood it as a question even without understanding the words. She said, "Ellie. My name is Ellie." He repeated it back. Slightly different shape to it, the vowels adjusted but recognizable. She nodded. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not a smile. A small reduction in whatever neutral thing he had been holding. He touched his own chest. Said his name. She tried it. He did the thing again with his expression. The small reduction. She tried his name again, differently. He nodded. This was the whole of their first conversation, and it was enough because language at its most fundamental is not about words. It is about acknowledgement. You exist. I see you. We are here. These are the sentences that matter most, and they do not require a shared vocabulary. Ellie decided she trusted him, not because he had earned it by any standard her mother would have recognized. Her mother's standard for trust involved time and consistency and evidence. Ellie was 7 and operating on different standards, the standards of a child who has been handed to a stranger by a mother she trusts completely, and so the trust transferred. Her mother had chosen this man. Her mother did not make choices that were wrong about people. The math was simple. She did not know this was not always how the math worked. She would learn that later. For now, she trusted him, and because she trusted him, she slept, finally, sitting up against the oak with her knees still pulled to her chest, her head dropping forward and then jerking up and then dropping again in the way of a child losing a fight against sleep that was always going to win. She slept. He watched the tree line. Somewhere behind them, 3 hours of hard riding into the breaking morning. The 5 men who had come across Martha Calloway's property were moving in a direction that the single rider had anticipated. He had read their method from a distance the evening before. He knew the shape of what they were. He knew it the way, something you have seen before in a different body, the same intent wearing different clothes. These were men who worked for someone who wanted something, and what they wanted had been riding on his horse all night. He did not know yet what the child was to them. He knew that the mother had chosen to separate from her rather than run with her, and he knew that this choice was made by someone who understood the terrain. The mother had done the math. The child was harder to catch than the mother alone. Give the child to the one variable in the situation that the 5 men could not predict or control, and the child lives. He had read all of this in the mother's face in the 3 seconds she had stood in front of him. He had read something else there too, something beneath the calculation, something that did not have a word in his language or in hers, the specific expression of a person handing over the thing they cannot afford to lose, the last piece, the one that if it goes the whole structure falls. He had seen that expression before. Different face, different country, different everything. He knew what it asked of him. He had taken a child. Now he needed to understand what he had walked into. He moved carefully through the live oak toward the higher ground east of the water, found a place where the limestone made a natural shelf, and he could see back along the valley they had come through without being visible from below. He read the distance. He read the color of the light off the open country. Movement. 2 miles out, coming along the valley floor. 2 men. The other 3 were not visible. That was the thing about 3 invisible men. You had to assume they were somewhere worse than where you were looking. He went back to the child. She was asleep against the oak. He woke her with a hand on her shoulder, the careful pressure of someone who knows that waking a sleeping child abruptly produces the wrong result. She came up slowly, confused, and then the confusion resolved, and she looked at him, and he saw her remember everything. Her face did the thing he had seen her mother's face do. The grief and the fear going somewhere interior, replaced by the flat, functional expression of someone who has decided that falling apart costs more than they can pay. She was 7 years old. He indicated with his hand, up, moving now. She stood up without asking a single question. They moved along the water, staying in the tree cover, moving northeast, and then east, the direction chosen not because it was towards safety, but because it was away from the 2 visible men, and perpendicular to wherever the 3 invisible ones might be positioned. He was solving a geometry problem with incomplete information, the same problem he had been solving in various forms for most of his life. The child kept up. She did not complain. She did not ask where they were going. She watched his feet and matched the way he moved, stepping where he stepped, avoiding the dry branches and the loose stone, learning the method of moving through this country the way you learn a language, by immersion, by necessity, by doing it badly at first, and then doing it less badly, and then doing it right. By mid-morning, she was moving well enough that he only had to slow down twice. By noon, they had found the upper creek that he had been navigating toward, the one that ran down from the caprock into a system of narrow canyons that he knew, and that the 5 men, he was reasonably confident, did not. He led her into the first canyon. The walls rose on both sides, limestone the color of old bone, cedar growing out of the cracks in ways that seemed to defy the basic logic of what plants need. The sound of the men behind them disappeared. Sound does strange things in canyons. He knew which kinds of strange. He used them. They stopped at midday at a place where a seep came out of the canyon wall and made a small pool in the rock. Ellie looked at the water. She looked at him. He nodded. She drank from her cupped hands, careful and efficient. She splashed water on her face. She looked up at the canyon walls the way she had been looking at things all morning, the focused cataloging look that he had started to recognize as her primary mode of processing the world. She was building a map in her head. He recognized this too. She pointed up at a ledge 15 feet up the canyon wall where a bird was sitting. She looked at him. He told her the name of the bird in his language. She said it back. Almost right. He told her again. She got it. She pointed at the seep, the small dark patch of wet rock. He told her. She repeated it. They did this for 15 minutes, standing at the seep in the bottom of the canyon. Object and name. Object and name. The birds and the rock and the water and the sky. Two people building the smallest possible bridge out of the words for the things directly in front of them, because the word for the things directly in front of you are the first words, the foundational words, and once you have those, you can start to build toward the words for everything else. He had not expected this. He had expected fear. He had expected crying. He had expected the specific difficulty of moving through dangerous country with a small, frightened child who needed to be managed and soothed and reassured. Instead, he had this serious-eyed girl pointing at the world and wanting its names. He gave them to her. And somewhere in the giving, he noticed that a thing he had been carrying, something dense and settled in his chest that he did not look at directly the way you do not look directly at old wounds, had shifted slightly. Not lifted, not gone, shifted, the way a stone shifts in a current. Still there, moving differently. He did not examine this. He looked at the canyon walls. He looked at the direction they had come from. He looked at the child, who was now pointing at a lizard on a rock and looking at him with her cataloging expression. He told her the word for lizard. She said it perfectly. He started moving again, east along the canyon bottom, and she fell in beside him, and the lizard watched them go from its warm rock, indifferent to the specific history of what was passing through its canyon, only aware of the movement, only aware of the sun, only aware of the ongoing fact of being exactly where it was. They moved deeper into the stone. Behind them, the canyon bent, and the entrance disappeared, and there was only the narrow strip of sky above, and the seep sound fading, and the two sets of footsteps on the canyon floor, one measured and deliberate, and one smaller, matching learning. The afternoon opened ahead of them. The canyon went on. They went with it. Martha Calloway made it to the river. She made it through the river, chest deep in October water that was cold enough to make her understand, without any poetry about it, exactly how small the margin was between being alive and being something the river was simply carrying. She made it up the far bank on her hands and knees, coughing, the rifle held over her head the whole way, the one thing she had kept dry because it was the one thing she could not afford to lose. She lay on the far bank for 3 minutes. Then she got up. The men had not followed her across the water. She did not know if this was because they had given up or because they were looking for a shallower crossing further down, but she treated the absence of pursuit as a resource the same way she treated everything else, something to use, something finite, something to move on before it ran out. She moved east along the far bank until the landscape gave her a rise of ground, and she climbed it and looked back at the country she had come through. Nothing moving. The light was wrong for seeing detail, and she knew it, and she used the time to think instead of strain her eyes at shadows. What she knew, Ellie was with the rider. The rider had taken her west and south into cedar country. The 5 men were somewhere between her and that cedar country. She had a rifle and 12 rounds and no food and wet boots, and the temperature was dropping in the way that late October drops, not gradually but decisively, the way the frontier made most of its decisions. What she needed to get back across that country and find her daughter, which required either avoiding the 5 men completely or going through them, and both of these options required information she did not have. What she had instead of information, the memory of the rider's face. She had spent a long night along the river running that face through her mind. The way he had looked at Ellie before he took her. The way he had not asked any of the questions she had been prepared to answer. Not who are those men, or what do they want, or why should I take your child. He had read the situation off the landscape, the way certain people read landscapes. The way her husband had read weather, not from a single sign, but from the whole accumulated pattern of everything, light and sound and movement and absence of movement, the thing that is there and the thing that is conspicuously not there. He had taken Ellie because he understood what was being asked of him. She believed this. She was also aware that she believed it because she needed to believe it, and that need did not make it true, and she held both of these things simultaneously the way you hold a lit lantern on a windy night, knowing it can go out, keeping it going anyway. She went east, not because east was safe, because east was toward Gideon Farr's place, and Gideon Farr was the worst kind of help, but right now she needed any kind. She reached his property by late morning, walking the fence line up from the road, and she saw him before he saw her, standing in the doorway of his barn looking at a horse's leg with the focused expression of a man doing arithmetic about money. He looked up when she came through the fence gate. He looked at the rifle and her wet clothes and her face, and he said, "What happened to you?" Not a question. An inventory. She told him enough. Not all of it. She told him about the men. She did not tell him about the rider or Ellie. She had learned early that Gideon Farr's help was calculated help, and the calculation would change if he knew she had given her daughter to someone else, because then the situation was no longer about a widow in trouble. It was about a missing child, and missing children in this country attracted a different quality of attention from men like Gideon, the kind of attention that asked what she's worth, and to whom, and what's my percentage. She kept Ellie out of it. She said, I need a horse, and I need to borrow one of your men for a day. He looked at her. She looked back. He said, you got nothing to trade me for that. She said, I've got 40 acres on the Concho. A pause. He said, I'll get a horse. She had known he would. She had run that particular negotiation in her head during the walk east, and she had known how it ended. She had also known that 40 acres was not a trade she wanted to make, and she made it anyway, because Ellie was on the other side of it, and the math was simple. The horse was a good one, which surprised her, because Gideon Farr was not known for giving anyone more than he had to. She took this as a sign that he expected to own the horse again shortly, which meant he believed her situation was worse than she had described it, which meant he had heard something. She did not ask him what he had heard. She took the horse and the name of the man he was lending her, and she went. The man's name was Cole, and he was young and had the kind of face that hadn't decided yet what it was going to settle into. He rode well and didn't ask unnecessary questions, which made him more valuable than most, and he had a second rifle, which she was also grateful for, because 12 rounds felt very much like not enough, and it had felt that way since she started counting. They went west. The morning was clear and cold, and the ground was dry, and the tracks she was following were not the tracks she had made the night before. She had picked up a different story in the dirt, 2 horses moving fast from the direction of her property, moving northeast, and then cutting west, and then northeast again, the pattern of men who were covering their trail and not covering it well, which told her something about their confidence level. They thought they had her. They were looking for the child, not her. This changed the geometry. If they were focused on finding Ellie, they were moving toward the cedar country where the rider had gone, which meant she was moving toward them the same way they were moving toward Ellie. Same direction, different intent. She pushed the horse faster. Cole rode beside her without comment. He had the good sense of a man who understood that this was not his story and that his job was to be useful in it. They reached the gully by mid-morning. The cedar beyond it was still, the kind of still that is not emptiness but attention. She stopped the horse at the edge of the gully and looked at the tree line for a long time. Cole looked at it too. He said, quiet. 2 of them came through here maybe 2 hours ago. He was pointing at the gully bottom where the tracks were clear in the sand. She said, which direction? He said, west and south, into the canyon country. She felt something move through her that was not quite cold and not quite heat, something that landed in the center of her chest and stayed there. The rider had taken Ellie into the canyon country. The men were following into the canyon country. She went down into the gully. The canyon country west of the Concho was a landscape that did not negotiate. It was limestone and cedar and hard sky and the particular cruelty of terrain that looked passable from a distance and was not. People who didn't know it got lost in it. People who didn't know it tried to track through it and lost the tracks in the stone, and the stone all looked the same from the wrong angle. And then the sun moved and the shadows changed, and nothing looked like what it had looked like an hour before. She had never been into it. She suspected the 5 men hadn't either. She suspected the rider had. This was the only thing she had that looked like an advantage, and she was riding toward it as fast as the horse could take her through brush country that wanted to slow everything down. They found a first man 2 miles into the cedar. He was not one of the 5. He was sitting on his horse at a cedar break looking west, and he turned when he heard them coming, and he was young, younger than Cole, and his horse was nervous in the way horses get when they have been standing for a long time waiting for something. Martha stopped. The young man looked at her rifle. She looked at him. She said, "Are you with the men who came through here?" He said, "I'm with my uncle. He sent me to wait here." His uncle. She filed this. One of the 5 was someone's uncle, and he had sent his nephew to wait at a cedar break, which meant he expected someone to come back through that cedar break, which meant he knew this country, or he knew the rider knew this country, and he was positioning for the exit. She said, "How many of you are there?" He looked at her rifle again. Cole shifted beside her. The young man said, 6. 6. She revised the count in her head. 5 plus 1 position here, plus possibly more she hadn't seen. She said, "What do you want with my daughter?" A small reaction. The horse moved under him. He said, "I don't know anything about a daughter." He knew something about a daughter. She said, "You have two options. You tell me why your uncle wants the child, and you ride away from here, and this is done for you personally. Or Cole shoots your horse, and you walk out of the cedar country on foot, and your uncle decides what to do with you when you show up without your animal." Cole looked at her. He had not known he was going to shoot anyone's horse. She looked at Cole with an expression that communicated, "Yes, you were." Cole moved his rifle. The young man's horse sidestepped. He said, "My uncle works for a man in San Angelo. There was an inheritance. The child's father left something that her mother didn't know about. My uncle was hired to find a deed." A deed. Martha looked at this information from several angles. Her husband had left a deed she didn't know about. In 2 years of managing everything alone, she had gone through every paper he had ever touched, sorted everything in the house, everything in the barn, had learned the entire inventory of what she owned down to individual fence posts. She had found no deed. But Daniel Calloway had been a man with a history before he came to the Concho country, a history he had not shared all of, and she had known this and married him anyway, which is a thing people do when they love someone. They accept the parts they don't know the same way they accept the parts they do. Her daughter was out in canyon country with a stranger because of something Daniel had left behind before he left everything else. She looked at the cedar. She looked at the young man. She said, "Ride away." He rode away. She watched him go until the cedar took him. Then she looked at Cole and she said, "Did you understand any of that?" He said, "Enough." She said, "Are you still in this?" He said, 40 acres is 40 acres. Fair enough. She went into the cedar. The trail went cold almost immediately. The limestone ground holding nothing, the cedar growing close enough that passage could have happened anywhere and left nothing behind. She stopped and used her ears instead of her eyes, the way she had learned to do on the Concho in the years since Daniel died, the way the country teaches you to read it if you spend enough time in it. She heard water. Down. East. The sound of a seep or a small run. She followed the sound. The first canyon opened up before her like something the limestone had decided. Not a gradual widening, but an abrupt declaration of itself. Walls going up on both sides, the skies suddenly narrow overhead. She stopped at the entrance and looked in. Nothing visible. She went in anyway. The canyon floor was sand and limestone and the bones of old cedar that had fallen and dried. She moved along it slowly now, the urgency of the riding replaced by the different urgency of being in a place where speed was wrong, where speed would announce her, where the right way was careful and present, one thing at a time, each step its own decision. She was 100 yards into the canyon when she heard the voice. A child's voice, speaking a word she did not know. She stopped. Then she heard again. Different word. And a lower voice underneath it, given the word, and then the child's voice taking it back, slightly adjusted. She came around a bend in the canyon wall. They were sitting at a seat pool, the rider and her daughter. Ellie was cross-legged on the limestone with her knees touching her ankles, her posture the posture of a child who is entirely comfortable in the place where she is sitting, and she was pointing at the canyon wall and saying something, and the rider was telling her the word for what she was pointing at. Ellie looked up. She saw her mother. Something moved through her face that was not the relief Martha had expected. It was more complicated than relief. It was the face of someone returning from somewhere and not being entirely sure yet which of the two places they are in, the place they left or the place they came back to. Then it resolved. She got up. She crossed the canyon floor at a run and hit Martha at full speed, and Martha went down on one knee with the impact of her, caught her, held her, pressed her face into Ellie's hair, and breathed. The smell of cedar. Cold water. Her daughter. Martha held on. Over Ellie's shoulder, she looked at the rider. He was looking at her face the way he had looked at it when she first came to him, reading it, taking the inventory. She looked back. Between them, across the 10 feet of canyon floor and across everything that had happened since the evening before, a great deal was communicated that had nothing to do with language. She said, "Thank you." He looked at the canyon walls. He looked at the direction they had come from. He said something that she did not understand. Ellie, her face still buried in Martha's shoulder, translated without lifting her head. She said, "He says they are still coming." Martha looked at the rider. He nodded. She looked at the canyon walls, at the narrow strip of sky, at the direction they had come from, and the direction the canyon went. She shifted Ellie to her hip, stood up, looked at the rider, and said, "Then we move." He looked at her. Something in his expression changed. Not the small reduction she had seen him give Ellie. Something older and more considered. He stood. He moved toward the deeper canyon. Martha followed. Ellie's arms were around her neck, and her daughter's breathing was even and warm against her collarbone, and the canyon walls went up on both sides, and the strip of sky above was blue and cold and very far away, and somewhere behind them the sound of men moving through the wrong country for the wrong reasons was getting closer, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was already past. Maybe it was coming from a direction they hadn't calculated. She did not know. She moved anyway. The rider moved ahead of her through the canyon, and she watched his back, and she thought about what the young man had said. A deed. Something Daniel left. Something worth sending 6 men into canyon country over. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the things you do not say to the people you love. She thought about Ellie, her daughter's weight on her hip, her daughter who had spent a night in a canyon learning the names of rocks and birds from a stranger, and who had come back to her mother carrying those names like stones in her pocket. Something collected, something added. The canyon went on. They went with it. And the blue strip of sky above them was cold and clear and carried no particular opinion about any of it. The dead man's secret, and the living woman's grief, and the child who had not cried when the world handed her to a stranger because she was 7 years old and she was her mother's daughter, and she had already learned the most important thing this country had to teach. You do not put down the thing you are carrying until you reach the floor. And when there is no floor, you keep walking. The canyon went around a bend. They followed it into whatever was on the other side.